The sharp clink of handcuffs snapping around Jack Weston's wrists echoed in the quiet air of Brier Ridge's lone gas station. "Keep your hands where I can say them, old man," the young officer barked, his voice tinged with a nervous edge he couldn't quite mask. "You're under arrest for disturbing the peace." Jack, a wiry 68-year-old with silver hair that defied any comb's discipline, didn't so much as blink. His gray eyes, sharp as flint, locked onto the distance, unyielding, as if he could see through the officer, through the worn asphalt lot, through the decades that had carved lines into his weathered face. That silence, heavy, deliberate, and unnerving, made the officer shift his weight from one foot to the other, his hand hovering near his holster, unsure why this old man's stillness felt like a storm waiting to break. Jack's thoughts churned beneath that stoic exterior, a mix of resignation and quiet defiance. He'd faced worse than this, far worse, but the weight of being misjudged again pressed against his chest like an old wound flaring up. In the courtroom the next day, the air buzzed with whispers before Jack even took his seat. To the townsfolk of Brier Ridge, he was just another grizzled veteran, a man who'd let his temper slip in public, now dragged before the judge to answer for it. The prosecutor, a young woman with a crisp suit and a sharper tongue, eyed him like a puzzle she'd already solved. The bailiff, guiding Jack to his chair, avoided his gaze as if the old man's silence might burn. The judge, perched high behind the bench, skimmed the charges with a bored frown, assuming this was just another small-town squabble. None of them knew, none could have known, that the man before them had once steadied his breath, aligned his scope, and saved an entire battalion with a single impossible shot. Jack's mind drifted to that moment, the memory vivid, the desert heat, the weight of the rifle, the heartbeat in his ears as he calculated wind and distance. He'd never spoken of it, not to anyone in this town, and the secrecy was both his shield and his burden. But someone did know, and that someone, a figure with 4 stars gleaming on his shoulder, was striding through the courthouse doors, carrying a truth that would unravel the room's assumptions like a pulled thread. Jack Weston wasn't the kind of man you noticed unless you had no choice. At 68, he was lean as a rail, his frame honed by years of discipline and solitude. His silver hair, always a little wild, caught the sunlight like a faint halo. But his eyes, those piercing, unyielding eyes, made people look away. They held a quiet intensity, as if he'd seen too much and carried it all inside, locked tight. He lived on the edge of Brier Ridge, a small southern town where life revolved around Friday night football and the occasional 4th of July parade. His cabin, tucked just past the tree line, was a weathered thing of gray wood and a sagging porch, with no mailbox to invite the world in. Jack liked it that way. To him, solitude wasn't loneliness. It was peace, hard-won and fiercely guarded. In his mind, the world was noisy enough without his voice adding to the clamor. He'd spent years perfecting his distance, letting the town spin its stories about him while he kept his own counsel. Every Tuesday, like clockwork, Jack made his pilgrimage to town. He'd pull up to the gas station, the only one in Brier Ridge with a pump meter that still clicked reliably, buying canned beans, coffee as black as motor oil, and enough fuel to keep his old truck running. He moved with purpose, his steps measured, his face unreadable. Small talk was a foreign language to him. He'd nod if someone greeted him, but only if he had to. The high school kids, with their endless energy and cruel nicknames, called him Sergeant Silence, whispering it behind his back as they dared each other to wave at him. The older folks, the ones who remembered when Brier Ridge was even smaller, called him that old sniper, their voices a mix of respect and unease. Everyone else just gave him space, sensing that Jack Weston was a man you didn't cross, not out of fear, but out of some instinctive understanding that he was different, untouchable in a way they couldn't name. Theories about Jack swirled through Brier Ridge like dust on a summer breeze. "He's got PTSD, one woman said over coffee at the diner, her voice low with pity. "No, he's just bitter," countered a man at the counter, shaking his head. "I heard he sleeps with a loaded rifle by his bed," a teenager whispered, eyes wide. "I heard he talks to ghosts," another added, half joking but half believing. None of it was true, or at least none of it was provable. No one had ever set foot in Jack's cabin, and no one had the nerve to ask for an invitation. What little the town knew for certain was that Jack had served in the Marine Corps decades ago. There were murmurs of classified missions, of tours that spanned deserts and jungles, of a sniper shot so precise it had once been a world record. But in a town like Brier Ridge, facts had a way of blurring into legend, and Jack never offered a word to set the record straight. He didn't care what they thought, or so he told himself, though sometimes, late at night, the weight of their whispers pressed against him, a reminder of how far he'd drifted from the world. When word spread that Jack had been arrested at the gas station, the town leaned in, hungry for details. The incident itself seemed almost trivial at first glance, the kind of thing that would have been forgotten by supper if it hadn't involved Jack Weston. A young man, barely 25, claimed Jack had threatened him over a parking spot. The kid, all bravado and gelled hair, said Jack had stepped close, his voice low and steady, and muttered something about knowing how to drop a target without missing. The cashier, a nervous girl barely out of high school, said she hadn't caught the exact words, just the tension in the air. A mother nearby, clutching her toddler's hand, swore she'd felt unsafe, though she couldn't say why. The sheriff, a man young enough to be Jack's son, didn't bother sorting through the confusion. He arrived with 2 deputies, his chest puffed out, and slapped the cuffs on Jack without hesitation. Jack didn't fight back. He didn't explain. He just extended his wrists, his face as blank as ever. Though inside, a quiet anger simmered, not at the sheriff, not at the kid, but at the way life had a habit of dragging him back into its mess. He'd been here before, not in this exact moment, but in this feeling. Judged, misunderstood, reduced to a shadow of what he'd once been. And so he stayed silent, letting the world spin its story around him, knowing the truth was coming through those courthouse doors. Jack Weston found himself confined to a cold, dimly lit holding cell, the kind of place that reeked of stale coffee and regret. He wore the same scuffed boots he'd slipped on every Tuesday for years, their leather cracked but reliable, a quiet testament to a life of routine. Now he sat waiting for a trial that, to the outside world, seemed inconsequential, a fleeting story that might flicker across the county news before fading into obscurity. To the townsfolk of Brier Ridge, it was just another tale of a cantankerous old veteran stirring trouble. Perhaps it warranted a brief mention in the local paper. Perhaps it didn't. But what no one, not the deputy who slapped on the cuffs, not the prosecutor scribbling charges on a legal pad, could have imagined was that this man, dismissed as a worn-out nuisance, had once saved dozens of lives in a single harrowing day. Jack never spoke of it, not because he sought secrecy, but because he didn't live for recognition. He lived to do what was necessary, then slip back into the shadows of the pine-lined hills, unnoticed and unbothered. The arrest didn't spark national outrage or dominate evening broadcasts. It barely earned a corner column in the Brier Ridge Gazette. Yet for the few who witnessed it, the incident left an indelible impression, a nagging sense that something deeper lay beneath the surface. It unfolded on a blistering Wednesday afternoon, the kind where the sun beat down mercilessly, baking the cracked asphalt outside the gas station off Route 18. Long shadows stretched across the lot, and Jack Weston stood by pump number 2, his arms folded tightly across his chest, his weathered face etched with quiet resolve. His pale blue eyes, sharp despite his years, were locked on a young man pacing nearby, shouting into his phone with a venom that seemed to poison the air. The young man's voice carried accusations of entitlement and disrespect, his words slicing through the humid stillness. Onlookers later swore Jack barely uttered a sound, if he spoke at all. But the young man, his face flushed with anger, his gestures wild and erratic, claimed otherwise. He jabbed a finger toward Jack, insisting the old man had muttered a chilling threat, something about ending him from 800 yards. That single accusation, flimsy as it was, ignited the spark. Within 10 minutes, the wail of sirens cut through the afternoon haze. 2 patrol cars and a hulking sheriff's SUV screeched into the lot, kicking up dust that hung in the air like a bad omen. Deputies spilled out, their hands hovering near their holsters, their postures tense as if they'd rolled up to face a dangerous fugitive rather than a gray-haired man in faded denim. Jack didn't flinch. He leaned lightly against the pump, his stance calm, almost expectant, as if he'd seen this scene play out in his mind 100 times. Inside, though, a quiet storm churned. He felt the weight of their assumptions, the way their eyes sized him up as trouble before he'd even open his mouth. It wasn't fear that gripped him. He'd faced far worse than this, but a bone-deep weariness, a frustration that after all these years, the world still misunderstood men like him. One deputy barked, "Hands up!" Another followed with a sharp, "Sir, turn around slowly." Jack complied without a word, his movements deliberate, his dignity intact despite the humiliation. The cuffs snapped on, biting into his wrists, tighter than necessary for a man whose hands had long since grown stiff from age. A few bystanders winced at the sight, their discomfort fleeting. No one stepped forward to protest. One officer, younger than the rest, pushed Jack toward the cruiser with a shove that felt more personal than procedural. Jack stumbled for a split second, his boots scraping the pavement, but he caught himself, his balance a reflex honed by years of discipline. Inside, he burned, not with anger, but with a quiet resolve to endure. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. Not now, not ever. Even when a reporter from Channel 5 shoved a microphone through the cruiser's open window, her voice eager and probing, "Sir, do you have anything to say about what happened today?" Jack offered nothing. He stared straight ahead, his jaw set, his silence louder than any words could have been. To her, he was just a story, a soundbite to fill airtime. To him, this was just another moment to weather, like a storm rolling through the hills. By the time the court date loomed, the local media had spun their narrative. Headlines like "Former Marine Snaps at Gas Station," "Inveterate or Menace," circulated online, fueled by a grainy still from the gas station's security footage, showing Jack's furrowed brow and steely gaze. The image painted him as a brooding recluse, a man whose silence was now twisted into something menacing. Social media amplified the story, with strangers dissecting his character based on a single frozen moment. To them, Jack was a stereotype, an angry old man with a grudge against the world. They didn't know the weight he carried, the memories of a day long ago when he'd risked everything for others. They didn't know, and Jack didn't care to tell them. Inside the courtroom, the air was heavy with unspoken tension. The judge, a woman in her mid-40s with sharp eyes and a schedule that left no room for patience, flipped through the case file with a sigh. To her, this was just another item to check off, a minor disturbance clogging her docket. She felt a pang of irritation. Not at Jack, but at the system that forced her to juggle cases like this alongside more pressing matters. The prosecutor, a young man with a polished suit and an air of self-assuredness, saw the case as a slam dunk. He glanced at Jack, sitting stone-faced at the defense table, and saw a closed book, an easy conviction. He didn't wonder about the man's past or the reasons for his silence. He didn't need to. His job was to win, and Jack's lack of defense made that prospect all but certain. Jack's public defender, a harried woman with a caseload twice her capacity, barely glanced at him until the judge entered. She'd met him once before, a brief consultation where he'd spoken sparingly. "I don't want to talk," he told her, his voice low but firm. "Just tell the truth." She'd nodded, but inside she felt a flicker of frustration. How could she defend someone who wouldn't help himself? How could she tell the truth when he gave her so little to work with? She didn't know the depths of Jack's story, the lives he'd saved, the burdens he carried. To her, he was just another client, another name on a file she'd barely had time to read. As Jack entered the courtroom, escorted by a bailiff who radiated boredom, he felt the eyes of the sparse audience on him. A few locals sat in the back, their curiosity tinged with judgment. They whispered about the crazy vet who'd scared some kid at the gas station. Jack ignored them, his focus inward. He thought of the hills beyond the courthouse, the quiet of the trees, the life he'd built away from the noise of the world. He didn't want their pity or their praise. He wanted to be left alone, to do what needed doing and move on. But as he sat there, the cuffs long gone, but their sting still lingering, he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, this trial, this misunderstanding, was a reckoning for a life spent in the shadows. In the cramped, stuffy courtroom, a hushed anticipation rippled through the crowd as they leaned forward, their eyes fixed on the man at the center of it all. Jack Weston, a name whispered in town legends, stood as an enigma to most. Some had heard tales of his past, stories of a sniper whose precision was as mythic as it was terrifying. Others, drawn by curiosity, simply wanted to catch a glimpse of the man whose reputation cast such a long shadow. Jack sat at the defendant's table, his weathered denim shirt clinging to his broad shoulders, his faded jeans hanging loosely on his lean frame. His boots, though caked with dust, gleamed faintly at the toes, a small act of defiance against the neglect of time. His posture was unyielding, spine straight as a rifle barrel, a stark contrast to the slouched indifference of the room around him. The judge let out a weary sigh, his patience fraying under the weight of routine. The jury, restless and disengaged, fidgeted in their seats, their faces a canvas of boredom. The prosecutor's lips curled into a smug smirk, confident in the narrative he'd woven. Across the aisle, the public defender, a young woman with tired eyes, scribbled furiously on her yellow legal pad, her focus never lifting to meet Jack's gaze. To the courtroom, Jack's silence was a puzzle. He didn't speak, didn't argue, didn't even blink as the accusations hung heavy in the air. To some, it reeked of arrogance, a cold detachment that bordered on guilt. To others, it was indifference, a man too far gone to care about the world's judgment. But to those rare few who understood the weight of silence, its discipline, its burden, its unspoken pain, it was something far deeper. A story untold, a history buried beneath years of solitude. Jack Weston was a stranger in this room, his truth obscured by the assumptions of those who saw only an old man, too quiet, too hardened, too alien to trust. No one in that courtroom truly knew Jack Weston, not yet. They didn't see the man who had once been a hero, celebrated with parades and waving flags, only to be forgotten when the cheers faded. The world honors a soldier when he returns, draping him in gratitude and pride. But when the banners are packed away, when the crowds disperse, what remains is silence. A silence that clings to a man like a second skin. To the jury, Jack was a relic, a shadow of someone who no longer fit in the world's neatly ordered boxes. His quiet demeanor, his unyielding gaze seemed to confirm their suspicions. He was dangerous, untrustworthy, a man who belonged on the fringes. But they couldn't see the Jack Weston who had existed 2 decades ago, in the blistering, unforgiving heat of Fallujah in 2004, where the air was thick with dust and despair, and survival hinged on instinct and precision. It was a day seared into Jack's memory, though he rarely spoke of it. A convoy had been ambushed in a narrow alley on the northern edge of the city, pinned down by a relentless hail of bullets that shredded concrete walls like tissue paper. The chaos was deafening, shouts of desperation, screams of the wounded, the frantic clatter of men trapped with nowhere to run. Radios were useless, crackling with static. No air support was coming, no medevac to pull the wounded to safety. Only smoke, thick and choking, and the faint hope of prayers hung in the air. Jack Weston, then Gunnery Sergeant Weston, was already perched on a rooftop nearby, his eyes scanning the horizon through the haze of diesel fire and swirling dust. He didn't wait for orders. Orders were a luxury he couldn't afford. With the steady calm of a man who had long since made peace with death, he moved into position, a ghost slipping through the chaos. His modified M4A3 sniper rifle rested against his shoulder, its weight as familiar as his own heartbeat. Years of training had honed his instincts to a razor's edge, his muscle memory guiding him as he peered through the scope. One by one he found his targets. A shooter on a distant rooftop, a fleeting shadow in a broken window, each neutralized with a single deliberate shot. 12 rounds, each one a life preserved, each one a weight added to the invisible burden he carried. But it was the final shot that defined him, the one that no one thought possible. A young lieutenant, Paul Hendress, was trapped behind a collapsed wall, his 3 wounded men bleeding out beside him. Insurgents were closing in, their silhouettes darting across a rooftop 936 yards away, a distance that mocked the limits of human skill. The angle was brutal, the wind erratic, whipping through the alley in unpredictable gusts. Jack's heart pounded, not with fear, but with the weight of responsibility. He adjusted his scope, his mind racing through calculations. Wind speed, distance, the faint sway of his own breath. The target was moving, a blur of motion sprinting across the rooftop, visible only through the narrow open hatch. Jack exhaled, his world narrowing to the crosshairs. He fired. The bullet found its mark, and the hatch slammed shut with the weight of a falling body. For the first time in an hour, the alley fell silent, the gunfire replaced by the ragged breaths of survivors crawling to safety. That day, Paul Hendris lived because of Jack Weston. Years later, retired and settled in the quiet plains of Montana, Paul still carried the weight of that moment. In his mind, he had written a letter to the court, though it was never sent, never read. In it, he poured out his gratitude, his voice trembling with the memory of a man who had saved him without hesitation or expectation. Jack never asked for a medal, Paul wrote. He never lingered for praise. He just did what needed to be done. I owe him my life. We all do. Those words, though unspoken, were a testament to the man Jack had been, a man who carried his duty like a sacred vow, even when the world turned its back. Back in the courtroom, Jack sat as still as stone, his face a mask of calm that hid a storm of memories. The jury saw only silence, but they didn't know the strength it took to steady his hands in a sandstorm, to hold his breath as lives hung in the balance. They didn't know the nights he lay awake, replaying that day in Fallujah, wondering if he could have done more, saved more. The media hadn't cared to ask about his past, content to paint him as a villain in their headlines. The public defender, overworked and underprepared, hadn't dug deep enough to uncover the truth. To the world, Jack Weston was a mystery, a man whose silence was mistaken for guilt. But to those who understood the cost of war, the price of survival, that silence was a language of its own, a language of sacrifice, of resilience, of a man who had given everything and asked for nothing in return. The world loves a hero when the flags are flying, when the bands play and the crowds cheer. But when the parade ends, when the uniforms are packed away, what remains? For Jack Weston, it was the weight of memory, the burden of silence, and the hope that one day someone might look past the faded denim and see the man he truly was. After the uniform is neatly tucked away in a drawer, its creases still sharp but untouched for years, what remains? After the medals, once gleaming with pride, are stowed in a box, gathering dust in some forgotten corner. After the body begins to protest with aches that whisper of battles fought in silence, burdens too heavy to share. Men like Jack Weston don't shatter under the weight of their past. They carry it, like an invisible load strapped to their backs. Memories of comrades lost, of choices made in split seconds, of the cost paid to keep others alive, haunt them. The world, too busy with its own noise, often mistakes this quiet burden for bitterness, slapping a label on something it can't comprehend. That's exactly what unfolded in the small, sleepy town of Brier Ridge, where an old man, once a savior in the shadows, now faced judgment for his silence in the face of accusations. No one cared to dig into his past, to understand the man behind the whispers. They just assumed, gossiped, and pointed fingers. Yet Jack held his tongue, not out of emptiness, but because his words had already been spent in places where they mattered most. On desolate rooftops under hostile skies, along jagged ridgelines where silence was the difference between life and death. Places where every heartbeat was a victory, where a man's worth wasn't in what he boasted, but in what he proved when the world wasn't watching. The faint crunch of tires rolling over the gravel lot outside the Brier Ridge County Courthouse barely stirred the air inside. No blaring sirens, no flashing lights, just a sleek black SUV easing into a parking spot no one else would have dared claim, right at the foot of the courthouse steps. Above, etched into weather-worn stone, the words Brier Ridge County Courthouse, Esther, 1897, stood as a quiet sentinel. General Alan McCrae stepped out of the vehicle, lone. No entourage trailed him, no aides scurried to keep pace, no press hounded him with questions. Just the man himself, his tall frame steady and composed, dressed in a crisp civilian suit that couldn't hide the soldier beneath. A muted military green shirt peeked out at the collar, where the faint glint of 4 silver stars caught the light. Every step he took radiated purpose, the kind forged in battlefields most only glimpsed in hushed late-night news reports or obscure declassified files. McCrae wasn't a man who chased spotlights or polished speeches. He'd never been a politician, never cared for the domains of public perception. Even after retiring, he led as he always had, from the front, with a quiet authority that made others instinctively sharpen their posture when he entered a room. For decades, he'd commanded elite special operations teams, navigating them through missions so perilous they were known only in whispers among the initiated. His name was a legend, a touchstone of respect among warriors who understood the weight of sacrifice. But today, McCrae's mission was different. He hadn't come to address generals or soldiers in some high-stakes briefing. He'd come to a small-town courthouse, to a room full of strangers who'd already made up their minds about Jack Weston, a man they didn't truly know. Inside, the trial droned on, heavy with the weight of finality. The prosecutor, mid-stride in his closing argument, wove a damning tale of a man broken by his past, a bitter recluse who'd turned his resentment on the world. His words painted Jack as a relic, a man adrift, clinging to memories of faded glory and lashing out in instability. The jury, slouched in their seats, looked drained, their eyes glassy from hours of testimony. Their faces betrayed a mix of boredom and resignation, as though the verdict was a formality. The judge, her expression stern, stole a glance at the clock, her patience visibly thinning. Even the public defender, seated beside Jack, seemed to have given up, his shoulders hunched, his silence louder than any defense he might have offered. Jack sat still, his weathered hands folded in his lap, his face a mask of calm. But inside, his heart was a battlefield. Every accusation felt like a blow, twisting his life into a caricature he didn't recognize. He thought of the sleepless nights, the memories of that crept in, uninvited, flashes of comrades' faces, of moments when he'd acted without hesitation to save lives, of the losses that still clung to him like shadows. He wondered if anyone here could ever grasp what it meant to carry that weight, to live with the quiet pain of things left unsaid. He didn't expect their sympathy. He'd learned long ago that some truths were too raw, too heavy, to be shared. Then, the heavy wooden door at the back of the courtroom creaked open. At first, no one paid it any mind. People came and went, reporters sniffing out a story, locals curious for gossip, jurors straggling in late. But when General McCrae stepped through, the air seemed to thicken with something unspoken. The bailiff, who'd been slouching against the wall, snapped to attention, his eyes widening as though he'd felt a shift in the room's gravity. The clerk, her fingers poised over her keyboard, stopped mid-sentence, her breath catching. The judge, high on her bench, raised an eyebrow, her gaze sharpening with curiosity. McCrae said nothing. His presence spoke louder than words ever could. He strode forward with the courtroom, his steps steady, deliberate, carrying the weight of a man who'd earned his place there through years of service and sacrifice. The prosecutor faltered, his voice catching mid-sentence, thrown off by the sudden intrusion of a man who seemed to carry history itself in his wake. The public defender, roused from his apathy, lifted his head, a spark of hope igniting in his weary eyes. He'd almost forgotten what it felt like to have someone fight for his client. Jack, still seated, tilted his head just enough to meet McCrae's gaze. For a fleeting moment, their eyes locked, a silent exchange that spoke volumes. In that glance, Jack felt a rush of gratitude, a quiet reassurance that someone, at least someone, knew who he truly was. McCrae's steady gaze held no pity, only respect, and it steadied Jack's heart against the tide of judgment crashing around him. He felt a flicker of connection, a reminder of the unspoken brotherhood forged in places far from here where loyalty was proven in blood and silence. The judge leaned forward, her expression shifting from curiosity to anticipation, as the room held its breath, waiting to hear what this man, this unexpected figure, had come to say. In the heavy stillness of the courtroom, Judge Eleanor Harris leaned forward, her voice measured but laced with caution, as if stepping into uncharted territory. "Sir, can I assist you?" she asked, her eyes narrowing slightly, trying to gauge the man standing before her. General Alan McCrae, retired, gave a slow, deliberate nod, his weathered face carrying the weight of years spent commanding respect in rooms far more chaotic than this one. "I believe you can, Your Honor," he replied, his voice steady, resonant, cutting through the murmurs like a blade. The room fell silent, as if the air itself held its breath. He introduced himself, his title hanging in the air like a banner: General Alan McCrae, former commander of U.S. Special Operations. The name alone stirred a ripple of recognition among those who knew it, but even those unfamiliar could feel the authority in his presence. It wasn't just his posture, ramrod straight, shoulders squared, or the way his eyes scanned the room with a quiet intensity. It was something deeper, an unshakable gravitas no lawyer's practiced eloquence could hope to mimic. The prosecutors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their carefully prepared arguments suddenly feeling fragile. The jurors, some of whom had been doodling or staring blankly, now sat upright, their attention locked on the man who seemed to command the very space he occupied. "I'm here about the defendant, Jack Weston," McCrae continued, his tone firm but not pleading. "He doesn't know I'm here. He wouldn't have asked me to come. That's not his way. But I'm asking to speak, not as a favor, but as a duty I owe." His words carried a weight that seemed to settle over the courtroom, pressing against the walls, demanding to be heard. Judge Harris, momentarily caught off guard by the intensity of his presence, regained her composure and nodded. "Proceed," she said, her voice betraying a flicker of curiosity. McCrae turned to the jury, his movements deliberate, like a soldier stepping onto a battlefield he'd already mapped in his mind. He carried no notes, no prepared speech. He didn't need them. His voice, deep and unhurried, filled the room with a quiet power. "I've read the reports," he began, his gaze sweeping across the jurors' faces, each one now hanging on his words. "I've watched the footage. I know what this courtroom thinks it's judging. But let me be clear, you don't know the man sitting at that defense table." He gestured toward Jack Weston, who sat motionless, his weathered hands folded neatly in his lap, his eyes fixed on some distant point. To the jury, he was just an old man, unremarkable, silent, seemingly indifferent to the accusations swirling around him. But McCrae saw something else. Someone else. "You see a man who doesn't defend himself," McCrae said, his voice softening but never losing its edge. "I see a man who once stood as a shield between life and death for men like me. In Fallujah, when everything was chaos and the line we held was crumbling, Jack Weston didn't just hold it. He rebuilt it, bullet by bullet." His words painted a vivid picture, pulling the jurors into a world of smoke and gunfire, where survival hung on the precision of a single man. 12 confirmed kills in 5 minutes, he said, letting the number sink in. One shot, in particular, saved an entire unit pinned under relentless enemy fire. That shot didn't just stop a firefight, it saved my life. It saved the lives of my men. He paused, letting the silence stretch, heavy with the weight of memory. The jurors' eyes flickered with new understanding, their earlier disinterest replaced by a dawning respect. McCrae's voice grew quieter, almost reverent, as he continued. "Jack never spoke of it. Not then, not now. Men like him don't act for praise or medals. They act because it's who they are. Their courage, their sacrifice, it's in their silence, not their words." He took a step back, turning to face Judge Harris again, his expression unyielding, yet tinged with something deeper. An unspoken plea, not for mercy, but for truth. "Today, that silence is being misread as guilt," he said. "I couldn't stand by and let that happen. Not to him." The courtroom was still, the air thick with the gravity of his words. The jurors, once detached, now studied Jack Weston with fresh eyes, as if seeing him for the first time. The man at the defense table remained unchanged, stoic, silent, his face betraying nothing of the storm within. McCrae stood at the front of the courtroom, his presence as commanding as it had been on any battlefield. He was steady, precise, unshaken by the weight of the moment. But what he said next wasn't part of any calculated strategy. It came from a place raw and unguarded, from memories etched into his soul, from scars he carried in silence, and from a debt that had haunted him for 31 years. He turned back to the jury, his eyes briefly meeting Jack's before shifting to the gallery, where reporters, onlookers, and families sat in rapt attention. 31 years ago, he began, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of recollection, I was pinned behind a collapsed wall just outside Fallujah. My unit was scattered, cut off from each other. Our radios were dead, useless. 2 of my men were bleeding out, and enemy fire was coming from every direction. Rooftops, windows, alleys. There was no air support, no medevac, no hope of reinforcement. We were alone and we had minutes, maybe seconds, before they closed in and finished us. He paused, his gaze distant, as if he could still hear the crack of gunfire, feel the sting of dust and blood in the air. The jurors leaned forward, their breaths shallow, pulled into the scene he described. Then out of nowhere, he continued, his voice softening, a sniper started taking them out. One by one, each shot was precise, surgical, like the hand of God reaching down to pull us back from the edge. I counted 12 shots in just under 5 minutes, each one a lifeline, each one buying us seconds we didn't have. His eyes flickered with a mix of gratitude and pain, the memory still raw after all these years. The last shot, he said, turning to Jack Weston, who still sat motionless, his face a mask of calm, came from over 900 yards away, through a rooftop hatch, in a crosswind, on a moving target. It was a shot no one should have been able to make, impossible, and yet it happened. He turned back to the jury, his voice steady but carrying the weight of truth. That sniper was Gunnery Sergeant Jack Weston. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, a quiet wave of awe and disbelief. Judge Harris shifted in her seat, her composed demeanor faltering for a moment. A juror in the front row, a middle-aged woman with a notepad, stopped writing and stared. A local reporter, his camera half raised, lowered it slowly, his jaw slack. When we finally made it out, McCrae said, his voice quieter now, almost reflective. No one knew who had saved us. Jack didn't stay to be thanked. He didn't wait for medals or handshakes. He just moved on, like he always did. That's the kind of man he is. He let the words hang in the air, their simplicity carrying a weight no argument could match. Jack Weston remained still, his eyes fixed forward, his silence louder than any defense he could have offered. The courtroom was no longer just a room, it was a crucible, where truth and memory collided, reshaping perceptions in their wake. McCrae's words had stripped away the veneer of the trial, revealing the man beneath the accusations. The jury, the judge, the gallery, they all saw Jack Weston differently now. Not as a defendant, but as a hero whose silence spoke louder than any words could. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, but General Thomas McCrae's voice cut through the noise like a blade, heavy with conviction and laced with sorrow. They're calling him a threat now, he said, his words slow and deliberate, each one landing like a stone in still water. They say his silence means he's hiding something, that he's guilty, but that man, he pointed to Jack Weston, seated at the defendant's table, his face carved from years of unspoken burdens. That man has carried the weight of his fallen brothers for decades. Their voices live in his quiet. He's earned the right to keep his peace. McCrae's eyes swept the room, taking in the jury, the spectators, the reporters scribbling furiously in their notepads. His gaze wasn't accusatory, but it held a challenge. How dare you judge what you can't understand? Inside, McCrae's heart churned. He'd known Jack for half a lifetime, through the chaos of war, through nights when the only thing louder than gunfire was the scream of loss. Jack had been there, steady as a mountain, when McCrae thought he'd break. Now, seeing his old friend treated like a criminal, shackled and scrutinized, ignited a fury in him that he struggled to contain. It wasn't just about Jack, it was about every soldier whose sacrifices were forgotten, whose silence was mistaken for shame. This courtroom, with its cold formality, felt like a betrayal of everything they'd fought for. To McCrae, putting Jack on trial wasn't a mere error. It was a wound to the nation's soul, a failure to honor the men who'd built its freedom on their backs. Jack Weston sat motionless, his hands resting on the table, the cuffs around his wrists glinting faintly under the fluorescent lights. To the onlookers, he might have seemed detached, but inside a storm raged. He'd never wanted this, never wanted his life dragged into the open, his choices dissected by strangers. Silence had been his refuge, a way to honor the friends who'd never come home. Every time he thought of speaking, their faces flashed before him and the words died in his throat. Now, as the courtroom judged him, he felt the weight of their suspicion pressing down, threatening to crack the armor he'd worn for so long. Yet, beneath the ache, a flicker of resolve burned. He wouldn't beg for their understanding. He'd lived his truth, and that was enough. Then, without warning, General McCrae did something that shattered the room's fragile tension. He turned to Jack, his movements slow but deliberate, and lowered himself to one knee. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Jaws slackened, eyes widened, and the bailiff, a burly man named Carl, took a hesitant step forward, his instincts screaming that something extraordinary was unfolding. McCrae's gesture wasn't born of theatrics or submission. It was raw, unyielding gratitude, a recognition that words alone could never capture the debt he owed Jack. For years, Jack's silence had been met with distrust, his sacrifices overlooked. McCrae knelt to say what the world had failed to. "You are seen. You are enough." McCrae's voice softened, but it carried a weight that silenced the room. "I came here today because I couldn't let history erase what men like Jack Weston have done for this country. I owe him my life. More than that, my soul. This courtroom owes him respect, not judgment." His words trembled with emotion, and in that moment he wasn't a general, but a man haunted by the past, desperate to right a wrong. Kneeling before Jack, he felt a surge of pride mixed with pain, knowing that this act might not undo the years of misunderstanding, but hoping it would spark something. Recognition, maybe, or remorse. For the first time, Jack stirred. His chest tightened as he watched McCrae kneel, and a flood of memories crashed over him. Blood-soaked battlefields, whispered promises to dying friends, the endless nights when silence was his only companion. McCrae's gesture pierced through the walls he'd built, stirring a warmth he hadn't felt in years. Slowly he rose to his feet, not out of arrogance, but out of a deep, unspoken bond. He stepped forward and extended his hand, his fingers trembling slightly. Not from fear, but from the overwhelming sense of being truly seen. McCrae grasped it firmly, rising to stand beside him. In that handshake, they were no longer general and soldier, witness and defendant. They were brothers, forged in the crucible of war, bound by a loyalty that transcended time and judgment. The courtroom transformed in that moment. It was no longer a sterile arena of law, but a sacred space of reckoning. Spectators sat frozen, their breaths shallow, as if afraid to disturb the weight of what they'd witnessed. The air felt charged, heavy with the realization that they'd been wrong. About Jack, about what silence could mean. For Jack, the jury's verdict was irrelevant. He'd never needed their approval to know who he was. But standing there, hand in hand with McCrae, he felt a shift. For the first time in decades, the world seemed to see him not as a mystery or a threat, but as a man whose life had been a testament to courage and sacrifice. The silence that followed wasn't the usual courtroom hush, where people waited for the next procedural step. It was profound, almost holy, as if the room itself was holding its breath in reverence. Judge Eleanor Hayes, who'd presided with crisp efficiency until now, felt her composure waver. Her hands gripped the edge of her bench, knuckles whitening, as she fought back tears. She'd seen countless cases, but none had shaken her like this. Looking at Jack, she saw not a defendant, but a man whose story had been buried under suspicion. Glancing at McCrae, she felt a pang of gratitude for his courage to speak what others wouldn't. With a steadying breath, she reached for her gavel. "In light of the testimony and the extraordinary context revealed today," she began, her voice catching slightly, "this court finds it in the interest of justice to dismiss all charges against Mr. Jack Weston, effective immediately." The gavel's tap was soft, almost gentle, as if she were closing a book rather than ending a trial. It was a signal that this chapter, one that should never have been written, was finally over. Carl the bailiff approached Jack, his usual sternness replaced by something softer. He'd escorted Jack into the courtroom hours earlier with a sense of duty, but now he moved with care as if handling something fragile. His fingers worked gently to unlock the cuffs, and they fell away with a quiet clink. Jack didn't flinch or rub his wrists. He simply stood there, his shoulders squared, his gaze steady. Inside, he felt a release, not just from the cuffs, but from the weight of a world that had misunderstood him for too long. Jack Weston stood at the defense table, his posture unyielding, his face carved from stone. No flecks of muscle, no sigh of relief or defeat escaped him. He simply locked eyes with the bailiff, offering the faintest nod, a gesture that might have whispered gratitude or merely acknowledged the moment's gravity. It was enough to ripple through the courtroom, a quiet signal that shifted the air. As he stepped away from the table, his movements deliberate and heavy, the weight of the trial seemed to settle over everyone present, pressing down like a storm cloud finally breaking. The prosecutor, still seated, was a picture of disarray. His fingers fumbled through stacks of paperwork, as though the answers to what had just unfolded might be buried in his notes. His confidence, so sharp during the trial, had dulled. His mind raced to make sense of a verdict that felt like it had slipped through his grasp. He avoided looking at Jack, perhaps unable to face the man who had unraveled his carefully constructed case with nothing more than silence and presence. Across the room, the public defender watched Jack rise, her expression a mixture of awe and regret. She had been quiet for most of the trial, her role reduced to procedure, to paperwork, to defending a case rather than a person. Now, as Jack stood tall, she realized her mistake. She hadn't seen him, not truly. She'd been assigned a file, a name, a number, not a man with a history, with scars both visible and hidden. In that moment, she felt the sting of her own oversight, the shame of having missed the depth of the soul she was meant to represent. Jack's quiet strength had been there all along, and she had failed to notice until it filled the room. As Jack turned toward the exit, the double doors at the back of the courtroom groaned open. They had been silent earlier, gliding without protest, but now their creak echoed like a cannon shot in the hushed space. The sound seemed to crack the tension that had held everyone in its grip, amplifying the moment's significance. Beyond the doors, there was no clamor of reporters, no chanting protesters, no chaos waiting to swallow him. Instead, there was silence, a profound, reverent quiet that felt almost sacred. Lined up just outside, standing shoulder to shoulder, were 7 men, veterans. They hadn't been summoned by the court, nor had they been called to testify. They were there because word had traveled, as it often does among those who've shared the weight of service. Some wore faded caps emblazoned with emblems of wars fought decades ago: Vietnam, Korea, Desert Storm. Others bore campaign pins on their jackets, small glints of pride pinned to humble cloth. Most were dressed simply, their clothing unremarkable, their faces lined with the years. But every one of them stood at attention, back straight, eyes fixed forward, as if answering a call only they could hear. Jack crossed the threshold, and the veterans saluted as one. No words passed between them. Not from the men, not from Jack, not from the guards who stood nearby, watching the scene unfold. Even the judge, still at her bench, remained standing, her hand pressed to her chest. It was as if she were trying to steady her own heartbeat, to hold on to the emotions swelling within her. She too felt the magnitude of what was happening, a moment that transcended the law, that spoke to something deeper, something human. Jack paused, his gaze settling on the first man in line, a gray-haired Army sergeant whose eyes carried the weight of Vietnam. The sergeant held his salute a second longer than necessary, a gesture of respect that went beyond protocol. Jack returned the same nod he'd given the bailiff, a quiet acknowledgement that spoke volumes. Then he moved to the next man, offering another nod, and the next, each exchanged a silent conversation between souls who understood the cost of service. With each step, Jack seemed to carry himself a little taller, though his face remained unreadable. General McCrae fell into step beside him, not leading, not following, but matching Jack's pace. The general's presence was a quiet promise, a vow that Jack would not walk alone, not today, not after all he'd endured. Together, they moved out into the morning light, where the sun was just beginning to crest over the courthouse roof, casting long shadows that stretched across the steps. The warmth of the rays felt like a small mercy, a reminder that the world still held beauty, even for a man who had carried its burdens in silence. Jack Weston didn't speak a word that day. He didn't need to. For the first time in years, perhaps in his entire life, the silence he bore was understood. It wasn't the silence of anger or defeat, but of survival, of a man who had fought battles both on foreign soil and within his own mind, and had come through them with his dignity intact. The world moves fast, too fast sometimes to notice men like Jack. We glance at people and judge them in an instant, by their clothes, their words, or their lack of them. He's bitter. She's distant. That one's broken. That one's dangerous. We rarely pause to wonder what shaped them, what wars they've waged, what losses they've carried long before we cross their paths. Jack never raised his voice, never pleaded for understanding, never demanded that the world see him for who he was. And because of that, the world had assumed the worst. It's easier, isn't it, to label someone as cold or angry rather than ask why they're quiet, to call them broken rather than imagine the weight they've shouldered. Veterans like Jack walk among us every day. Some wear caps that hint at their service, faded emblems of wars long past. Others carry invisible wounds, combat trauma, survivor's guilt, the ache of years spent in silence. Many return not to parades or heroes' welcomes, but to a world that feels foreign, to jobs that don't fit, to families who love them but can't always understand. As the years pass, their stories fade, pushed to the margins of a society that moves on. Mental health for veterans isn't just about therapy sessions or prescriptions. It's about being seen, not as a case file or a stereotype, but as a person. It's about being heard, not just for what they did in uniform, but for who they are now at home, navigating a world that often feels indifferent. Too often, their silence is mistaken for hostility, their solitude for failure. But what if it's neither? What if it's simply survival? Quiet, resolute, unyielding. What happened in that courtroom wasn't just justice for one man. It was a mirror held up to a nation, a call to reflect on how we see those who've served. Before we judge someone as bitter, we should ask what they brought home from the battlefield. Not medals, but memories. What names do they sleep? What moments replay in their minds when the world grows quiet? What burdens have they carried in silence, sparing not the rest of us from their weight? This isn't just Jack Weston's story. It's the story of thousands, fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, men and women who came home with the weight of wars still pressing on their shoulders. They don't ask for fanfare or pity. They ask for something far simpler, far harder, to be understood. Let's be a nation that listens, not when it's easy or convenient, but when it matters most. Let's be a people who asks instead of assumes, who seeks to understand the quiet ones, the ones who walk among us carrying stories we may never hear unless we try.